Welcome everyone to the next installment or the present installment of the Mediterranean Seminar podcast, which I think we're calling Let's Talk Mediterranean. I'm Brian Catlos, and together with Sharon Kinoshita, we are the co-directors of the Mediterranean Seminar and the hosts of this podcast. Today, our guest is Claudio Fogu, Professor of Italian Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and we're here to talk about his new book, The Fishing Net and the Spider Web, Mediterranean Imaginaries and the Making of Italians, which was published this fall by Palgrave in our series, Mediterranean Perspectives. And so with that, I will hand the mic over to Sharon.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Claudio, for joining us today. We're really excited about your new book. A couple of things. One is that both the previous two guests on our podcast and a lot of the discourse around Mediterranean studies has actually fallen in the pre-modern and early modern era. So it's very interesting to see your book picking up a lot of different intellectual threads and energies for the modern Mediterranean and for Italy in particular. So your first chapter or your introduction hints at your long engagement with Mediterranean studies as an Italianist and thinking about the history of modern Italy. So I wonder if you could just talk us through some of that background.
Thank you so much, Sharon and Brian, first of all, for inviting me to this podcast, but also for being the series editors of the Palgrave series that I published with, and your presence as series editors in that series, it was one of the motivations for my choosing that publisher. Sharon, your question just goes directly to a kind of engagement that it's even longer than I admit in the book. And in the sense that, yes, there is a personal part that has to do with a kind of Mediterranean envy of somebody that was born in the city of Perugia, which is very far from any sea, and lived vicariously a love for the Mediterranean through a kind of frequentation of the islands of Procida. But I think besides that, I started thinking about this topic actually back in 1994 when I was in Columbus, Ohio, and the Columbus celebrations were a moment in which this city that bore the name of this so-called explorer exploded, and there was a kind of strong sense of this kind of what we would call today a very transnational Mediterranean narrative going through different threads. So that's where started my scholarly engagement with it. And I think the delay in writing this specific book has had a lot to do with the shift, of course, of the Mediterranean itself, the contemporary Mediterranean, the so-called crisis of migration and emigres and refugees that suddenly darkened my vision of the Mediterranean and brought me into sort of a very personal confrontation with that dark side. And that what had started as exactly the kind of instinct to write about what I would say a positive imaginary, what I call the imaginary, I think it's now reflected in the cover of the book, in which the title and the picture of the book sort of are are in tension with each other. The picture, this beautiful painting called, work of art called Suture Mediterranee, which is sort of represents like something of the scars of the Mediterranean area of the contemporary time, and this idea instead of a fishing net, of a web, of a net, that is the one I worked with. So that's sort of the largest way that I could put my engagement with it. I don't know if I could answer your question sufficiently, but that's what made me just go through a very long process of thinking Italy through this web of interactions with a changing Mediterranean and a transnational one.
Okay, well, that's let's pull back a little bit, or maybe not pull back, actually hone in. The three of us have read the book, and actually one of us has written it. And that puts us at something of a disadvantage over most of our listeners. So perhaps you could give us something of a sort of summary of the book itself, and talk about what some of the implications are of your view of Italy and the Mediterranean.
Yes. So the book, let's say at a very large sense, is an attempt to reframe I would say, Italian cultural history as a nation from the point of view of its relationship to the Mediterranean. And of course, when I say the Mediterranean, I don't mean the thing in itself, but the discourse about the Mediterranean. And I would say that if we look at from this larger perspective to the kind of the formation of this discourse in the last the second half of the 19th century, the birth of Italy as a nation state and the formation of this discourse were coeval. And that's my departing point for looking at Italy as being in a very peculiar position in relationship to this discourse. And my fundamental goal in the book was to connect two strands of research about Italian cultural history that I've seen often taken very separate paths. The one about the Southern question, the so-called Southern question, the both racial and cultural Southernification of Italians, which I would consider to be the first result of unification. There was no South before unification of a nation state. So a nation state was born by dividing itself into two very fundamentally different and opposing camps. So that discourse on the Southern question appeared to me to be marked by the exclusion of the whole history of the south of Italy as a kind of biogeographical center of the Mediterranean. However, however problematic the term centrality is, I was just interpreting it in a kind of, initially in a biogeographical way. And then I started looking more closely into that and saw that, the repression of the Mediterranean was very systematic in the discourse of the making of the Italian nation. And that the Southern question was part of that discourse by precisely identifying the South with agriculture and land and and being tied to the land. So I saw that as being a first kind of exclusion of the Mediterranean and maritime life of the South from the construction of Italy, and a further way by which the South was marginalized, contained, and characterized by detaching it from its long-standing relationship with the Mediterranean Sea, Mediterranean commerce, and what we could call a kind of certain sense of Mediterranean culture, Mediterraneanness. And of course, I know that all of these are very problematic terms. But the second part, the second discourse that I have approached was then the discourse of making Italians, which in that sense I saw as being often divorced from the discourse of making Southerners, and instead I wanted to bring them together. And I saw that the Mediterranean was precisely that point of intersection by which first Southerners were made by subtracting the Mediterranean, and then Italians were made by adding the Mediterranean slowly, but in a very nationalist progression, which will obviously arrives at with fascism. And my revision, I'd say, of the fascist phenomenon has to do with actually showing how the primacy of discourse on the Mediterranean, it was actually even before both racial and Roman Latin connotations came into the discourse of fascism. So the Mediterranean was really fundamental as an aspiration of empire. And that's where, in a certain sense, I see the project. The project links this to, and in terms of the Southern question, there is this anomalous, I would admit, anomalous chapter that goes all the way back to look at the experience of the south of Italy when in ancient times it was part of this, it experienced itself as being the center of two different networks. One, the Greek diffused network that I call the fishing net, and the spider web of Roman Empire. And so I find that experience of the South was somehow, found many different cultural and social expressions throughout the history of the South. And although it was eliminated at first with the Risorgimento and unification, it still comes back into the fabric of Italian Mediterranean imaginaries by opposing or creating a kind of oscillation between the kind of imperium or empire imaginary that leads to fascism and other forms of network imaginaries that I call the fishing net imaginary, that are also present in fascism itself in the south of Italy. So it's a kind of complex narrative because it's not a unique, univocous narrative. And this, I would say, the process of oscillation is, to me, between spiderweb and fishing net does represent something that I see as characteristic of something Mediterranean, that sort of and which obviously also connects to Harden and Purcell's work on the Mediterranean. So that's where I see my intervention in Mediterranean studies legitimizing a view that I would say in which oscillation is an alternative to seeing things in a constant dialectic of resolutions, if I may sort of go a little bit in the more philosophical strand of my book.
Great. Can you take us a little bit deeper into your metaphors of the fishing net and the spider web? Because obviously they're prominent in your title and they're immediately engaging and intriguing, and you touched on them in your remarks, but I think it would help to have you fold out more fully what you mean by them and why you found them particularly useful.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. I think that the most cynics of my friends always tell me that I entitled the book and I created a book that could be put in the computer science box because it had both net and web, so that it could be purchased by mistake. I have to say that I obviously struggled a lot with maintaining these two metaphors as being a sort of guiding my research. My work with metaphors really comes from my engagement with Hayden White's work and as a theorist of history, and the importance that he attributed to guiding metaphors and to their ability to sort of become guidance, but also, to see that they would not force the material, and that one, the one had to be ready and willing to let them go if they couldn't hold water, let's say. And I found, to my surprise, that actually these two metaphors kept coming back and coming. And so the metaphors, let me respond now directly to your question, Sharon. The metaphors are interpretations of Irad Malkin's great book on the Greek small world, in which he applies network theory to the interpretation of the ancient Mediterranean. And I take Malkin's work and sort of apply it to the area that I'm most interested in, specifically the area of Naples and its islands, and sort of look at the way in which some of Malkin's ideas applied to that area can produce a sense in which we can really speak of the archaic Mediterranean as creating a fishing net of relations. And the metaphor of the fishing net is a metaphor that is especially useful to me to think about the role of islands as being what is caught in the net, and at the same time what is the price of the net, and the importance of these islands in relationship to the coasts. And so Naples' relationship with its islands and their role at different times becomes the narrative through which I talk about first the role of Ischia, and therefore the Pitecuse as the first Western Greek from Euboeans, the Euboean settlement, which represented precisely this very initial moment in which Tyrrhenians, Euboeans, and Phoenicians were constructing what I call the fishing net Mediterranean. And then, of course, Capri becoming the fundamental actual role of Rome. I mean, Capri in a way represents the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, with its villas and its avampost, and with Puteoli and Misenum as its harbors, where both the military and commercial power of Rome. And the idea of the spider web, I think it's very important to me because it reverses that sort of territorialized notions of the motto, all roads lead to Rome, because actually it inverts it, in which all roads from Rome lead to the Mediterranean. And that it sort of brings in this idea of the territorialization of the Mediterranean, which is also, of course, as we very well know, in the very fact that the term Mediterraneus was never used by the Romans for the sea, but it was used for land. So there is a sense in which this Mare Nostrum, this sense of territorialization, obliterates the sea as sea, and it provides a completely different type of network, but one that is consistently present. And so I return to it in the history of the South, but also show how much the earlier network seems to be prominent in constructing throughout times the kind of what we consider to be parts of this undeniable social economic diversity, including the idea of the civic economy in Naples in the 18th century, the Grand Tour and the place of Naples in the Grand Tour. So I reread many phenomena that have been very important from this point of view of their relationship to this metaphor of the fishing net.
Yeah, I really found those two metaphors to be really interesting as well. One can see the same sort of two sides of the coin. One thinks of the spider web as being something more sinister, and the fishing net as something more well, whatever the opposite of sinister is, I guess, unless you're a fish. But one of the things that I think initially surprised Sharon and I in our conversations, particularly with modernists, is that both being medievalists, we have a very particular view of the Mediterranean what its role in history was, and the sort of framework it provided for, human and cultural interaction and institutional and cultural development. And not so much anymore, but it used to surprise us often that when we spoke to modernists about it, for many, they really saw the Mediterranean as a sort of framework for colonialism. And it sort of had there was a certain toxicity associated with that as a sort of frame or a paradigm. Can as a modernist, can you speak to, obviously you talk about colonialism a lot in your book, but can you speak to another side of the Mediterranean that may be useful for modernists?
I think that's exactly, thank you, Brian, for that. That's exactly where the work, I think, of Olivia Harrison and her idea of the transcolonial comes into play. And I've been using it precisely because by positioning the south of Italy as the first colony of the Italian state, and so by looking at, and also let's remember that from the point of view of a colonial state, Italy as a peninsula was in a position of being called Las Indias de por acá for many centuries. So it was also in itself part of a colonial empire, the Spanish colonial empire, or part of French possessions, and of course, Austrian empire. So Italy, if we want to think about it as a territory, was one of the territories that where the occupation by constituted foreign powers was most prominent. So there is that colonial past that is part and parcel of this story, and the South becoming the first territory of an imperialist state. That's why I actually call and take to, in a certain sense, challenge Benedict Anderson's idea about the nation state as being the only imaginary sort of imagined community, precisely because it seems to me that the Italian nation state is more of an empire state. It's born as an empire state by occupying the south of Italy. And so that, Brian, makes me look at the way in which that part of Italy had instead remained much more attached to medieval and ancient ideas of Mediterraneanness. And although today, of course, our newspapers are full of news of not only of the criminal organizations, but also of the camps established by the Italian state in the south. I mean, I would just love to think about anybody establishing those camps in Genoa or in Turin or in Venezia. I mean, if we don't have a full-blown rebellion in Lampedusa or in Sicily or in Puglia, where many of these poor people are held, I feel it's also because there is some kind of socio-cultural stratum, which of course does not exclude conflict. On the contrary, absolutely. We've learned a lot about the alternate, but conflict implies a relation, and conflict implies a sense of resolution. It's not a process of othering like the others. That's where I think the poetics of relations of Glissant are my guiding point of reference to understand the difference that I theorize between belonging, which includes longing for, and identity, self-identity formations, which I see as being one option, of course, in the South, but also being countered by traditions of belonging that are still alive. And so that's where I would situate, Brian, the kind of medieval legacy. And what it's interesting to me is, of course, that in medieval times, we still don't have the idea of the Mediterranean, precisely because that's where I would say, as a modernist, I understand the Mediterranean to be a metaphor that comes with the first wave of colonization. And we know that the Mediterranean is a term that is born in Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, precisely around the time in which the Atlantic and the Pacific are being constructed as bodies of water. So it's almost a way for the first colonial wave to construct a unitary space of European action. That's, I think, where the modernist framework comes. But I am very much interested in recuperating also this much longer tradition in which the South, by being colonized, but also by connecting through its Middle Ages, through Amalfi, through, of course, Naples afterwards, maintains a kind of constricted realm. And I think that's where it's very important to understand 18th century and 19th century Bourbons as constrained within the Mediterranean, but in that constriction also becoming a dominant and again reassuming a certain centrality for the Kingdom of Naples after Venice had basically waned, as we know.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that in the Middle Ages they don't really talk about the Mediterranean as such, but it seems we never really talk about things as such until they're over. You know, and we can put them together. When they're in the middle of it, we don't see it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's probably precisely what I find as being important, because that lack of definition seems to me to be part precisely of what is staying behind, and that's where I think Matveyevich's book is still that discursive construction of a Mediterranean of diversities. I read it as a kind of waves of the diverse that keep coming, and there is no order to them. I mean, that book is about nature and waves and things and humans and human things and natural things, one after the other. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're thinking of when we think about the Mediterranean without the Mediterranean as this reified notion on it.
So you began by talking about your attraction from landlocked Perugia to Procida. And so it got me thinking, I mean, what's interesting about Procida, besides the beauty of it, is, you know, it offers you literally an eccentric view of Italy as nation. But I wanted to, in talking about the way that you've mobilized, you know, as a literary person, I keep returning to the metaphors. So to pick up again on the way that you've mobilized the fishing net and the spider web as metaphors, I'm also struck by the way you sprinkle in lots of material objects in your analyses. So beginning with your, you know, you open up onto the archaeological museum in Procida, so we're still in the same island area, the insularity there, but they're very graphic and beautiful material objects that you also, along with the metaphor of the objects like the fishing net, have found very useful. So I wonder if you could talk about the kind of shuttling back and forth between visuals as metaphor, you know, objects, material objects as metaphors, and material objects as maybe things with stories to unpack in a way that don't fit the narratives that have been constructed, or, you know, the dominant narratives that are in circulation.
Wow, thank you, Sharon. This is like really the kind of question that makes me happy to receive. If I knew how to answer it as well as you posed it, I'd be even happier. But I would say that, yes, that there is something that my experience in Procida and that material culture that I bring from having sort of lived a life of at least having been in those areas for 40 years, having taught courses on the island of Procida, having visited all of those museums, all of those areas over the years, has been tremendously important for allowing me to isolate and find places where even these intricate histories could be brought into artifacts. And the costume of Prochidan women, let's take that as it's, first of all, it's called costume, and the very fact that it's called costume obliterates the fact that this was actually the fundamental way in which women dressed on that island. And because it's been called costume, because it's so elaborate, and because it is so full of references to Turkish and Arab culture, has been looked upon as something to limit as a costume. But then when you go and look at the history of the island, you discover that this was an extremely rich island precisely because of its strategic position in relationship to the Arabs and Ottomans. And that commerce was lived with a culture, a very specific culture of women that had a certain kind of power on the island. And all of this has remained to the present, but we've lost the narrative to which it was attached. So I look at these objects as bringing back in cue with the narratives, and of course the case of those two statues that are found in the middle of this island, and nobody knows the story, or the story is being told in so many ways, but it is a story that tells the connection and the connectivity to this Arab and Muslim world that was normal for many, many centuries and was part of the life of the island. So I find that to be as important for me to give a sense in which these metaphors actually are embodied in these objects. And there is a relationship of embodiment. And I would say that's why I love your question, and it makes me feel excited that you noticed it.
Okay, well, our time is running out, but I did have one more question I wanted to ask you. One of the paradigms or processes that you discuss is meridianism, the construction of this north-south dichotomy or north-south opposition, this process in Italy's self-realization as a nation state. And it got me thinking actually of Nietzsche, and I think the genealogy of morals. And of course, he's speaking metaphorically, not historically, kind of. But you know, this really reminded me of that dynamic that Nietzsche sketched out of, you know, the domination of the northern blonde people over the you know, the more primitive, smaller, dark southern people. And so I wanted to ask, the processes that you discuss, although you very specifically discuss them, you know, in the context of Italy, do you see this as a broader phenomenon? Is it maybe you know, a consequence or a manifestation of what we might call the waning of the Mediterranean and you know, the hegemonic ascendancy of the European North, or am I totally out in left field?
No. I think and your suggestion goes even beyond, I think, just the blonde and dark. But if we think about the sort of foundation of the argument by Nietzsche, and the idea that Christian morality, or that the Christian morality has sort of transfigured the good and bad into the good and evil, is, I think, precisely what I'm talking about. The South that was conceptualized in the 18th century was a South that was the center of Europe, was the South that was actually a good, so good that it was central to the creation of a kind of cosmopolitan Enlightenment idea. And the South that is constructed in the 19th century is the kind of South of a secularization that has absorbed Christian categories, applied them throughout hierarchies of knowledge and power that Foucault and others have very well established for us, and that Nietzsche senses very much shifts to the past, but are actually acting in the secularization of culture, a secularization that has expelled God, but has maintained the moral framework. So that the moral framework, if you read Dickens' description of Naples, it's like this moral venom coming out of, even in the description of Pompeii, all he can see is the absurdity of people still living in those conditions, and sort of the sense that is completely blind to any of the factors that would be prominent in the sight of a British traveler of the 18th century. So yes, the 19th century is, Nietzsche, I think, senses it, and in the Genealogy of Morals gives it to us in terms of the transformation in the past. But the age of secularization is the second step of that transformation, in which that good and evil is southernized. The South is the internal other, and the relationship to Orientalism is precisely that of creating a kind of internal other to the external other. And I think that that's something that takes place in Italy in very symbolic ways, but it is, of course, something that is across the board.
Yeah, I guess in his description of Naples, Darwin is conveniently forgetting the dark satanic mills of his own country. But there you go.
Yeah. No, it's very telling to look at the sort of the shift that takes place, and of course there's power politics at play. The British interest in getting rid of the Bourbon kingdom, and let me just say this, Brian, because I know that there will be listeners to our podcast that might just come out and say, "Oh, another neo-Borbonico." This is a kind of epithet and accusation that is leveled only in the Italian fields that could exist something like that. And so this idea that there would be a defense of the Bourbons and that one would have to would defend them, and so the defense of Bourbons excludes you from any kind of conversation. Well, I'm totally willing to engage with anybody that wants to call me a neo-Borbone, to have them justify in different ways, or sort of discuss my ideas, but not just exclude me for neo-Borbonico, because I think my attachment to the topic and to the South has nothing to do with the Bourbons in themselves. I've never been particularly interested in dynasties. So I just needed to say that, if you allow me, because I know that that's an issue in Italian studies.
Okay, well, all that talk of Bourbons is making me thirsty. So we'll make a metaphorical toast then to your book. We're very happy to have it as part of our series. It's a wonderful book. I think it for me it was really really instructive and eye-opening to get this view of the modern Mediterranean that we talk a lot about in the Mediterranean seminar, but we seldom have the chance to address directly. So we really appreciate that. So thank you for coming today and speaking with us. It's a pleasure as always, and we'll look forward to your next scholarly opus. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you so much, Sharon. My event, one of the base steps in coming with the book was to attend your seminar and give one of my first talks on the book. So I owe you a lot, and I love the seminar, and I love this idea of this series. Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.